I want to welcome you to Two Components Every 2025. I can't believe I'm saying that, 2025. Safety plan should include. I'm Rebecca Timmins, and I'm here to talk about why there are two components that you should really consider seriously. There's an estimated 2.78 million workers that die at work every year around the globe. And that's in spite of a lot of hard work done by a lot of committed people at protecting workers. But we continue to see way too many tragic events. And I was thinking about the end of the year and planning. I bet everybody right now is sort of in the process of starting to plan for 2025. And it made me want to talk about your safety plan. I would guess most of you are in the process right now of doing that. I'm a big fan of goal setting, and over the years, I've really been very lucky to work with many organizations and help them figure out what is their plan for the next year. And whether they put a lot of work into it or a little bit of work into it, there is such power in having a plan. And what got me thinking about our topic today is, even with plans, what I hear way too often are these remarks. And think about if you've heard these in your own organizations. We were making great progress. We were working on our plan. Our recordables were coming down. We've had fewer lost times. We were feeling really good. We're even ahead of our target. And then bam, out of the blue, something terrible happens. There's an arc flash, a dock pool failure, a trench collapse, fall from a climbing vessel, someone gets pulled into processing equipment, and we're left wondering, how could this happen? How could we not know? Today, I'm going to talk about two components that will help with this problem. One, I know you're already doing, and so I'm advocating for it. You need an additional component to your plan. So this looks surprisingly simple, and I don't want you to take it as this is really straightforward and everybody should know this, but your plan really does need two components. You probably already have an excellent non-SIF reduction strategy. So think about blood, break, and bruise injuries, recordables, lost time, and most organizations are really doing a very good job of this. And we see the results of it. We see non-SIF events continue to decline. And that's true in the US, it's true globally. But in spite of having a great non-SIF reduction plan, it doesn't get at the SIF events. And I think this is what puts us in a position where it looks like we're doing really well in safety, and then we're surprised when something tragic happens. So I'm going to advocate today that you really do need two very specific strategies in your plan. And of course, how you're going to invest your time and resources and efforts across these two strategies is going to rely on your pool of exposure. So you really have to understand the complete pool that you're trying to manage. This matters because if you look at the data supports that in spite of what we're working hard on, all of our efforts, our engagement, all the things we do, we're not getting the results that we need. And so I bet all of you have seen this. This looks at workplace safety in the last 20 years in the US. It goes from 1999 through 2019. It's a little tiny, so I apologize for that. And it really looks at what is our performance. So you'll see the blue line, and you'll see that it is generally declining. This is the rate of non-fatal incidents. So these are your recordables, your lost time, your typically blood, break, and bruise. What we're really not seeing shifting is the yellow line, and that is the fatality rate. It's held relatively steady for the last 20 years, up until 2019. Now, we are looking at the data from 2019 to date, And it does look like there are segments, industry segments, where they've made really nice improvement in SIF. But the pandemic has played into that, and it's not as clear as we would like to see. But we can't argue the data. So that tells us that what we're working on, in spite of our hard work and efforts and commitment, it's not getting the job done. And that's why I feel so strongly that it's helpful if you think about your strategy from two different components, your non-SIF as well as a SIF. And I know we have a couple of folks joining us today that are outside of the US. This data is from the US, but if you look at the global data, the trend lines are very similar. It's the same challenge that we're seeing. This is what prompted the 2010 SIF study that was led by Dr. Krause. Sorry, I think the weather is changing and my nose is recognizing it too. Dr. Krause, so in 2010, pulled together a group of study participants. You see them on the screen right now. Great organizations that have a lot of exposure, have the potential for SIF events, and all very committed to protecting their people. And what this group did is they shared their data and they learned things. And that is what I want to talk a little bit about. What really motivates me is this study was done 14 years ago, and I am still running into leaders, organizations that are not familiar with the findings from this. And it's really helpful because it gives you direction and it helps you better apply your resources. So that is, that's why I want to talk about this. So in the study, we confirmed that Heinrich's triangle, so you all know Herbert Heinrich, he developed the triangle in 1931. It is descriptively correct. There are far many more minor injuries than major injuries than SIF, thank goodness. And the theory is if you shrink the base of the triangle, shrink the base of the iceberg, the overall triangle is going to reduce. And we now know that's not true, because what we learned in the SIF study was, while the triangle is descriptively correct, it does not accurately predict. This is the piece that I think it is so important for leaders to understand, not only professionals and folks in safety, but your operational leaders. What it did is we looked at 300 injuries, 64 had SIF potential. And that's what we're looking at here with the yellow triangle. So if the goal is to eliminate SIF at the top, and you're focusing on the base of the triangle, that's only going to help you if you happen to be focusing on this center piece. Sometimes that happens, sometimes it doesn't happen. Often it's not happening on purpose, it's just we're lucky. Sometimes we're not lucky and we spend a ton of time reducing injuries that are out here. Always good to reduce injuries, but if our goal is to eliminate those most serious catastrophic events, we've got to know what for our organizations are filling this in. Now, this group of data had a potential SIF rate of 21%. But I want to say that we see a lot of variety with our clients when we do this. And those rates can range from 14%, relatively on the low end, to a really high end of close to 60. It's really tied to the type of work that's being done, the level of exposure, your layers of protection. But you want to know what your number is. In your organization, you want to know what that rate is, because you want to be targeting your efforts and your resources on ensuring that these most catastrophic events don't happen. So as you're thinking about developing your plan for 2025, it's really important that you take this into consideration and you don't, not that any of you on the call would do this, but I do see folks fall into the trap of, we'll just do more. And doing more is not necessarily the best strategy. You've got to be really surgical, and you've got to understand for your organization, for the work that your people do, what is their potential for getting seriously hurt? How is it tied to the work? One of the things that is really helpful is understanding what your levers are. Now, when I think back of the organizations I've been lucky enough to work with, and I hate to say this, but I'm beyond my third decade. I'm doing this more than 30 years. And when I look at organizations that are most successful long term, and I measure that to mean they have eliminated SIF and they're able to go longer and longer periods between events, and when they have events, they're less and less severe. One common thread runs through those organizations, and that is they've learned to treat safety like they treat all their critical business systems. So when I say critical business systems, I'm thinking financial, productivity, quality, resource management, developing new services, new products for your clients, the things that make your business function and successful. We have to get safety into that same realm. So it's not treated as something special and to the side, but an essential part of running your organization. If you think about for yourselves, if you're in operation roles or safety roles, and people talk about financial and productivity measures, you know what your levers are. You know the numbers. You probably know them to a pretty high degree. You don't have to guess or hope that you're working on the right things to improve quality or to manage costs or to increase productivity. You know what those levers are. We want that to be the same case for safety, in particular for those things that potentially drive catastrophic events. So when we say SIF precursor, what does that mean? SIF precursor is simply you have a high-risk task that meets a defective safety control. So think for a moment in your organization of some of your high-risk tasks, perhaps where you've had an injury, a serious event. We want you to know what is your high-risk task, what controls are supposed to be functioning to protect, to provide layers of protection between the human and the hazard, and how are they not functioning? So when you have a high-risk task and defective safety controls, and you layer on top of that what we call risk amplifiers. So risk amplifiers are all the things that can increase the odds for an incident to happen. It can also increase the odds that if an incident does happen, it's more severe. And it's things like if you're working outside, changes in weather. It's having an inexperienced or an early career supervisor that doesn't have a lot of depth of experience. It's a workforce that has returned from the pandemic with much less experience. It can be as simple as people take their break for lunch, and when they come back, they're distracted and they don't rebrief. It's all those little things that layered over controls that aren't working well increase the odds that something's going to go sideways and happen that will be terrible. We put a lot of focus on understanding what your SIF precursors are. So one of the things I am going to suggest that you consider doing is, if you haven't already done this, identify what are your high-risk tasks. What tasks are people doing where the likelihood for a serious injury or fatality to occur exists? Focus on the controls that you are not 100% confident in. If you have controls that you are suspicious, they don't quite work all the time, or you know there's gaps, work to understand that. And then take a careful look at the culture of the organization, of the people, of the climate people are working in, and identify what are those risk amplifiers. This really is sort of the basis of understanding what is going to make up that middle section of the triangle within the triangle. I am just checking the chat. Any comments or questions about what we've talked about so far? I see a comment here from Ryan. How can corporate leaders effectively integrate proactive EHS strategies to identify and mitigate SIF precursors? That's a great question. And I think the corporate leaders are in a really good position to help support and enable this to happen. I think it's pretty straightforward. It's not simple. I don't want to suggest that. It is a lot of work. It's worth it, but I want to be honest, this takes effort. But I think first off, you really have to start talking about how are we going to be confident that we are not going to have something terrible happen. Having people die at work is horrible. And it has implications not only on the family, on the organization, on the team. And typically it's not good for business. So I think what corporate leaders can do to help is to have honest conversations about we're going to get after this. We're going to understand what our potential for SIF events are. We're going to have honest conversations about exposure and risk, about how our controls work. We're first off going to understand our current situation, and then we're going to put a plan together to really target those that are concerning us the most. The culture piece is huge. So when you think of the controls that you have in organizations that aren't working, they often go years without working because the culture is such that employees are hesitant to raise concerns or put their hands up and say, hey, I can't do this job in this state. They're good soldiers. They just figure it out. Part of the culture is how your safety leaders, particularly your frontline supervisors, are engaging with the frontline workforce. Do they understand the exposure that they have to manage? Do they know where the barriers to safe work are? We could probably do hours on this question, Ryan. But that gets you started. You've added to the comment, and it says, I see most companies have great strategies, yet they do not have the culture. They have policies and programs, yet their employees do not buy in. This is a challenge for us. If policies and programs got the job done, none of us would be on this call because there are plenty of SOPs, work procedures, safety manuals, critical process verification processes. All the mechanics are there. But that alone won't take care of it. You have to engage people from the frontline worker through the supervisor, through the manager, all the way up to your executive group on engaging people to use the process to raise concerns and to pause work when there's a problem. And that's all very cultural. I see a comment here from Rants. Culture works against culture change. That's right, because culture, the whole idea of culture is it stabilizes the organization. Humans like to know what to expect, and culture is a way that they're able to function. When we shift the culture or we try to make a change, it's really hard. People are resistant to it, and the culture can help us or it can just make it harder. It really does come down to the leaders, right? We say the leaders greatly create the culture. How much do they really want to shift? The problem I see often happening is the leaders that are trying to change the culture are the leaders that actually created that culture. So it's very challenging.
Rebecca, we had another question in the Q&A about providing a plan template. I think it probably was from your early slide where you talked about the 2 factors being important in building the plan.
Thank you, Pam. That moves me to actually the next slide. I like a good plan. I love a good checklist. And so as I was thinking about today, I put this together. Now, I'm not going to say that it is completely exhaustive, but it's pretty good. So as you're thinking about what do I need in my 2025 SIF plan, here is a checklist for you to give some consideration for. Now, this is specifically targeted at eliminating SIF. The first one is we know our organization's SIF triangle within the triangle. So that's the slice of the triangle that we know has SIF potential. And remember, that really does vary across organizations. What we've seen is a very big range, and it's heavily reliant on the work that's being done and the controls that are in place. So that's the first item. Do you know your SIF within the SIF triangle? Do you know your number? Do you know all your high-risk tasks with SIF potential? Do you have a list of, can you make a list of them? Do your employees know what those are? And do you know what controls are in place for each high-risk task? The one I'm always very curious about is the layers of protection. Most critical tasks have multiple layers of protection. The question is always, are they functioning as designed? If you look at the Swiss cheese model, that's the whole idea of providing protection. You have multiple layers that increase the odds that we're going to keep the human and the hazard separate. For SIF events, for SIF potential, understanding that it's really useful. Do you have a decision tree so that you're able to evaluate and categorize SIF potential? If you're on your SIF journey and you do not have this yet, I'd strongly advocate that you give serious consideration to developing it. The SIF tree will allow you to look at events with SIF potential, any event actually, and determine did it actually have SIF potential or not. A couple of things that I really like about the decision tree is it makes very consistent how you look at your events. I bet many of you have been in meetings where you're talking about an event and the question is, did this have SIF potential? Could this have killed somebody? And the conversation goes on and on. There will be people that will say strongly, absolutely not. This does not have SIF potential. You'll have people at the other end of the spectrum saying, absolutely, this could kill somebody. Conversation goes on, and it's frustrating and not terribly productive. A good SIF decision tree will help facilitate that. The other thing it will do is it will allow you to collect data in a very consistent, high quality manner. You know, one of the challenges that we have when we work with SIF is, fortunately, we don't have a lot of SIF events. So you don't have a large pool of data to study and evaluate. It means that every time you identify whether you have a SIF potential or not, you really want to have great data that you can rely on and use for making improvement. A SIF tree will help you in that direction. Once you have some of those tools in place, the next item that you want to think about is, do your people, do the employees in your organization, do they know what the most critical SIF precursors are? We regularly find that they do not. They have ideas, sometimes they're correct, sometimes they're not correct, but we're missing out on informing people so they know what to pay attention to. They know what it looks like when it shows up. Following that, do your people know what action to take around a critical SIF precursor? Do they know what to do when they see uncontrolled exposure? Do they recognize how important it is that they pause work and get help? Have you created a Pareto chart that looks at your most important SIF precursors and identifies the ones that you will get the best bang for the buck working on first? If you have unlimited resources, that's terrific. You can tackle all of this. That's generally not our situation. And that allows you to be very strategic in focusing on the ones that are most critical to get after and control first. If you've done that, then you can, in a very organized way, similar to how you would treat other critical business systems, you'd identify the most important CIF precursor or a couple of CIF precursors that you're going to focus on, and if not eliminate in 2025, that you are going to seriously advance in 2025. Put a plan together, and then you're executing your plan. And then the last one is a little different. It's a bias that we run into very frequently, and it worries us, particularly when we're thinking of this bias in relation to CIF. So do you have a strategy to guard against overconfidence bias? We see this show up at all levels in the organization, from your newest employee to your most senior to an executive. And you can see overconfidence bias not only in yourself, but you can see it in others. I'm going to talk a little bit more about bias in a moment. Before we do that, let's go back to the chat. There's one from Robert. Hi, Robert. It's good to see you. Robert and I worked together for years in a past life. His question or comment is, it is an education issue. I learned this at Yellow when Rebecca, that's me, and our team came and worked with us. Robert started at Roadrunner 7 months ago. That's great, Robert. And they have no concept of CIF exposure. We're now focused on identifying our exposure and putting controls in place. That's terrific. So if there are others on the call that are in a similar situation, so very early in your CIF journey, what Robert is sharing is a great way to start. First off, understand what your exposure is. Know what your CIF precursors are, and then take a serious study about what's our current situation, how effective are our controls, which are the ones that are working, which are the ones that are absent or that are weak, and then help people get on board with using them in a very consistent manner. I'm going to move us on to overconfidence bias. So if you Google bias, you will find that there are hundreds of biases out there. There's a handful that we see regularly show up and that have distinct impact on CIF, particularly around decision-making around CIF, safety-sensitive decisions. Overconfidence bias is the fact that we humans, we generally overestimate our knowledge. And if we're experts in the field, this is particularly true. We are overconfident in what we think we can do, what we know. That's overconfidence in self, but we also have overconfidence in others, where we think people know more, have greater skill, capability than they sometimes have. If you look at a number of the quotes that we've got on the slide here, I want you to start listening for these in meetings, in your facilities. They should raise the question of, are we looking at a situation where we have overconfidence? You'll hear things like, we're professionals. We don't need a procedure. We just know what to do. I've seen this before, and I've got it covered. We've got a great EHS team. They can handle the workload. This next one is one of my very favorites because I hear this a lot. We're smart. We'll figure it out. And then the other one I'll highlight is, we followed the plan. So everything was supposed to be done, must be done. So this is all overconfidence. And if you hear remarks like this, I want it to sort of give you the spidey sense of, are we looking at a situation where we're more confident than we should be? Doesn't guarantee it. It may be perfectly fine, but at least it should raise that on your antenna. Julie, hi. Julie has a comment here. What kind of decisions have you used in the workplace? Oh, in workplace violence to determine if an incident is a precursor for a SIF event? Um, that is really an interesting question. I just wrote a paper on workplace violence of what it could look like in the future. It's really complicated. It's a really complicated situation. Um, the I would definitely treat this as a SIF event. That was what my little paper was on, is we should think about workplace violence as a SIF event for the leaders in the organization. So, we focus so much on students, the public. We should also really focus on the managers and the leaders who actually have responsibility to protect people in that environment. Um, how can we help them recognize the precursors for a SIF event? And there's lots of them. One of the things that has struck me when I've looked at this, I've thought a lot about it, is that so many of the events that have happened, so just think back to school shootings, different type of events. There's tons of people that come out after the fact and say things like, I'm not surprised. We saw indications all along. There were lots of red flags. Those are all indications that there are precursors that we could identify and look to really get our arms around. I don't know if that really answers your question, Julie. Um, but it's something I would love to talk more about. Then Robert has another comment here. You cannot correct exposures you don't see. I agree. If you don't know what exposures are, if your eye isn't tuned to looking for exposures, you aren't going to find them. We have an example with another client where they had a team that were looking for exposures over a period of time, and they identified one. Our team went in for several things. One of those things was to really understand their exposure pool. And I think in a relatively short period of time, we found like 60 of them because our eyes are trained to look for things. And when we see them, we recognize them. It's something weird about our brains, but there's this challenge of you can look, but do you see? So, our brains tell our eyes what to look at. So, in terms of identifying and recognizing exposure, we have to train people so that their brains know what to look for. Because once you know what to look for, you can't miss it. It jumps out at you. Just checking the time here. I did want to just touch on a checklist for non-SIF strategy. We don't want anybody hurt in the workplace. I didn't go into great detail here because honestly, most organizations have good plans for getting after their blood, break, and bruise injuries. But I just thought we would just do a little touch base just for our due diligence. Please look at your 2024 data. The data tells a story that is so helpful in figuring out where your exposure is, where you have control, where you don't have control. And it can really guide what you definitely want to see in your 2025 plan. These are all things that I know that you already are attending to, but if you've introduced any new hazards into the workplace, anything has changed, understanding what the new risks are, checking control measures, those layers of protection, talking with the stakeholders, making sure that it's your first line leaders, your first line workers are understanding what the exposure is and what the plan is for improvement for 2025. Doing a good job of monitoring your progress and being able to say, we have a strong strategy to eliminate our blood, break, and bruise type injuries. I have to say this just because I can't help myself. But remember, retraining is rarely effective. So we still see in safety plans, people are going to do a lot of retraining to get everybody on board. And it is rarely effective. So if you're thinking about potentially retraining as the answer, I want you to rethink that Certainly, there's always training components for improvement, but it is by far not the one that's going to give you the best results. And then, of course, you have to take a systems view of injury causation. It is never a single cause. And so as you're thinking through your plan, just keep those things in mind. Robert has a nice comment here. He says, as Sherlock Holmes said, the world is full of obvious things which nobody by any chance ever observes. It's true. It's so interesting. If you have been involved in identifying exposures already in your organizations, that you've trained people how to do this or you're trained yourself, once that happens, you can't make it unhappen. You see line of fire exposure and you see it when you're at work, but you see it at home. You see it when you're working in the garage. You see it at the supermarket. You can't not unsee it. And so the value of helping people to build really good observation skills around exposures, the payoff is huge.
Rebecca, are we going into Q&A now?
We are going into Q&A. Pam is keeping me on track.
All right. We had a question submitted during the registration process. Someone asked us how to improve the reportability of incidents with high potential, and they asked that specifically associated with fatalities in mining companies. Now, I would believe that any high-risk industry might have a similar kind of answer, but how would you address the reportability of incidents with high potential associated with fatalities?
It's a really good question, and it really sort of covers all the things that we've just spent the last 45 minutes talking about. Certainly in mining, there are many potential exposures that you want to understand, but I think this is true in most organizations today where the likelihood of having someone die at work exists. And getting good reporting is a combination of things. It is knowing what you want. It's getting people to know you want them to report first off so that they'll come forward. Way too often when we have events, we still hear people saying, well, I sort of knew that was going to happen, but I didn't say anything. I don't think they really wanted to know. I've done it before and nothing's happened. So it's getting people to report. It's helping people know what to report and how to recognize this is something that I need to raise. All of that improves if you have identified your SIF precursors, if you know what your SIF potential is and you talk about it in an honest way, if you are able to really communicate, our goal is we don't want anyone to die at work. We don't want any critical events to happen that are going to change people's lives. And as leaders, we're willing to do things. And as frontline employees, we need you to be willing to do things. It's a team effort here to protect people at work. Getting people to report when you do those things up front, all of a sudden becomes much easier. Of course, you've got to have an easy way to report. We still run into situations where the reporting system is so complicated that people get tired or confused before they actually report. So it's also looking at, are we making this very enabled? I hope that helps.
There was also a related question asked in the registration process that says, I'm challenged because my organization is really focused on reportables. I can't budge them. It seems weird to switch from recordables, which we have a lot of, to SIF events, which we don't seem to have a lot of.
Yes. So what to do in that situation? I think it could help you if you take a look at your recordables, and if you have a number of them, I'm sorry about that, but it means you have a little pool of data to look at, and examine each one to see what was the SIF potential, and be able to talk about it in very real terms. So I'm thinking back to an organization where they had a boom truck that was traveling on, it was a refinery, traveling on the road within the refinery, and the boom hadn't been lowered, and it missed hitting a utility wire by I'm going to say less than a foot. And that was actually captured as a near miss. Nobody thought anything of it. But when they looked at it through the lens of, was there SIF potential here? SIF potential was huge. And had they not done that, they would have dismissed that as a near miss. It would have gone into the pool of near misses and nothing would have happened. So I would encourage you to think about a strategy like that. And if you want to talk further about it, just send me an email and we can just get on a Teams call and talk through it a little more calmly and quietly. And anything that I can do to be helpful, I'm happy to do that.
I'm going to ask you to flip to the next slide, Rebecca, so they have your email. I think that would be great.
Thank you, Pam. There are two more in the chat. One is, I think this is Omar. I apologize if your name is hard for me to say, so I apologize if I'm not saying it right. The comment is, at the moment, we just are talking about incidents for reaching SIF potential. In the same time, there's a lot of potential operations that might be potential SIF, even if it's not happened as an injury. How do we define those tasks? That's exactly what we're talking about in terms of the triangle within the triangle. It's looking at the work and understanding what those SIF precursors are. When you haven't had an event, it's the potential to have an event and then be able to talk about it. And Stephen has a comment here. The mining industry generally record HPRI or IPLL or NIPLL, that's a mouthful. All of these are incidents that could have resulted in a fatal event. Should more, if the circumstances were different. An example is a spanner falls from height on a walkway. This would be a high potential event, particularly if you have people working underneath. Yes. Anton, thank you so much for joining us. If I can help going forward, please just say the word. We'll be sending this out and happy to follow up. Mike, comment is JSA would call out processes with SIF potential. Yes, ideally they would, but generally they do not. But if you can build a SIF component into your analyses, that's wonderful because it's a way to trigger and remind people about it. The problem that I have seen is you can't just rely on a JSA. That's one of the tools to help an effective SIF strategy, help to inform and trigger and prompt the right practices that we want people following. And having it in the JSA is terrific.
That might actually be a nice segue to another question we had submitted in advance. Someone asked, what are some examples of leading indicators companies with strong SIF programs are using?
Yes. So this is one everybody's always interested in because it's really hard to do this. But I want to share a couple of examples that we're seeing clients do that they're doable and they're effective. Everybody would like to have a SIF-P rate, but it's really hard to develop and it takes a long time. I've seen clients get very enthusiastic and they create a SIF-P rate really quickly, and it's not helpful because it's not accurate. You've got to do a lot of work to really understand what that rate is. But along the way, here are some practices that you could think about doing. In the field, so this is in the work process. It's monitoring for high-risk tasks. How many high-risk tasks do you see being done? What are the amplifiers that are influencing? And then what defective controls are you finding? So it's a way of observing and gathering that data really live in the process of the work. To do that, you've got to have people that are tuned into this and are able to not only monitor and recognize it, but then know it's important to collect it, surface it up to the right people. So you can count those things. You can also That's sort of looking forward. Looking back, when you have an event, an injury occur, you can study it to see, were there any precursors involved? What were they? How many? What were the high-risk tasks? Because the better you know what those high-risk tasks are, the better focus you're able to have. What amplifiers were involved in the event? And then really what controls failed? When you have an event, you know controls have failed, and typically it's more than one. So you could actually measure those things. It's a little messy, but I'll tell you what, if you can do this, it's very helpful. And it engages everybody, because you need to have feedback coming in from the field, both at the front line, at first line leaders. You need to have the safety group helping with this. You need operations clued into it also. Pam, any other questions?
No, I don't see any other questions. I was just putting a note in chat inviting everyone to join us at our next webinar, which is on November 13th, where some representatives from Valet will be talking about their safety journey. You also can reach out to Rebecca via email or on LinkedIn, or please follow us on LinkedIn to get more updates about thought leadership and additional pieces like what Rebecca presented today. And I think the final thing we'd like to offer is, if you do not have a copy of 7 Insights into Safety Leadership, Dr. Krause and Kristen Bell's book, there is a code here, RT25. If you insert that when you order the book on our website, you can get 25% off. So certainly...
I want to make a plug for that also. If you've not read this, it really is worth it. It's easy, it's short, it's not academic, and it really distills down those practices that we know make a difference in creating great safety in your organizations. I do have one ask for everybody, and that is, I'm going to send you an invite on LinkedIn, and I would say please accept it. And then we can stay connected, and I would appreciate that very much. It's been a pleasure today. Thank you so much for your time. I wish you well in the rest of the year. I wish you very good fortune developing your plans for 2025, and I hope you have a great rest of the year.